everyone, my name is Matt Dean. I'm a graduate student at the University of California, Irvine, and my topic for this presentation is group immortality. So here's the plan. The presentation has two parts. In part one, I'm going to describe two common objections to individual immortality. So there are many reasons why we might be suspicious that living forever would be good for the well-being of an individual. I'm going to just cover two common objections. And at the end of part one, I'm going to arrive at my first conclusion, namely that individual immortality is undesirable from the perspective of individual well-being. Or perhaps a little more tentative, we might say it's at least plausible that living forever is not the way to maximize individual well-being. In section 2, I'm then going to take the two objections from section 1 and consider whether they apply to the life of a group. So I've tried to show, I will try to show in part 1 that there are two fatal objections to individual immortality. And the question for section 2 is, do those two objections apply equally? Are they equally fatal to thinking about group well-being and whether a good group going on forever is a good thing or a bad thing from the perspective of group well-being? So in section 2, I'll arrive at my second conclusion, which states that although we cannot and should not desire immortality for ourselves or from the perspective of the individual, we often can and often should desire that good group lives go on forever. So here are the two objections in broad outline, and then I'll go into more detail. First, the intuition we're trying to explain is that most individuals would not choose to live forever. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but this is generally a widely held intuition. Landau, in his 2019 book, reports surveying his undergraduate students over many years and having this consistently reported back. No, we do not want to live forever, say the undergraduates. I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to ask 35 high school students a similar question. Would you like to live forever? Is immortality, does that sound good? And 35 out of 35 said no, no thanks, does not sound good. And so here are two reasons that, two of the reasons given to explain this preference. First, that an immortal life would be boring, and second, that an immortal life would be guaranteed to experience an event so bad that would make the life not worth living. So if either of these objections succeed, then so much the worse for immortality. Let's see them in more detail. Okay, so what's the idea here? Why would immortality end up making life boring? Well, the idea is that you read a few thousand books, you watch a couple 100,000 movies, maybe you get married a dozen or a couple dozen times. You know, you watch your grandkids graduate college, your great-grandkids graduate college, your great-great-great-great-grandkids graduate college, and so on. Then what? So the idea here is that an immortal life would run out of interesting experiences, and as a result, this would run into a fatal kind of boredom, a type of boredom that is fatal to the idea that well-being is promoted by living forever. So you might say, well, what do you mean by boredom? Because I think, we use this word in different ways to describe different psychological states. So we see the idea here in Bernard Williams' 1973 paper, the Macropolis case, where this is where we get the claim, and an argument for the claim, of course, that an immortal life would necessarily be boring. But in what sense of boredom? Because we in everyday speech, we have these overlapping, maybe contradictory states that we call boredom. Is it momentary boredom? Is it, lifelong feeling that extends? from across multiple or many moments. What are we talking about? Well, Fisher and Mitchell-Yellen, 2014 paper, clarify that the type of boredom that Williams is interested in, and it seems to be the type that most of us are interested in when we endorse this intuition that an immortal life would be boring, is what they call it content boredom, namely the state of being without any desires that stem from projects that make life worth living. So the idea is that a life worth continuing requires novel experiences. So new experiences, something about nothing being new in an immortal life makes that life not worth continuing. So of course, take the books example. I mean, no matter how long you live, if there's other humans, we can imagine there'd be new books being written. More books than you could ever read, right? They're being written at a faster pace than you could read them. So what is it? Well, the idea is that, after you read 100,000 books, maybe you read 1 million books, maybe you've seen all that books can do. They can't provide novel experiences after millennia of reading books, perhaps. So that's the type of boredom that's at mind here. We lose interest in the types of projects that make life worth living because they're no longer novel. So that was objection 1. Objection 2 states that an immortal life would be guaranteed to experience an event so bad that it would make the life not worth continuing. So this one's more controversial, I think, or at least what different people mean by this claim might be different. So I've picked out 2 examples here that I think help illustrate the point, or help illustrate 2 different senses in which we might take this point. So the first one I think is more controversial, but the idea here is that it's possible for a life to be going well until some disqualifying event occurs. What I have in mind here is stated here is a beloved child dying due to a parent's careless mistake. So what I have in mind here is something like from Thomas Nagel's paper Moral Luck, where he describes a moment of neglect. When you're watching your beloved child in the bath, you have a moment of neglect, you go to answer the phone, you come back to find the child drowned. Now, this is extremely unlucky in the way that he frames it. It could have been, the child could have been just fine. In fact, 999 times out of 1,000, the child would have been just fine. But as a matter of luck, your moment of carelessness has this huge impact. And so the idea here in A is that, well, perhaps an event like that could make a subject feel that his or her life, that their life was not worth continuing. Now let's distinguish that from a life not worth living. Perhaps everything up to that moment was certainly worth living. We don't want to say this life was worthless, this life wasn't worth anything or not worth living, but the claim here is merely it's a life not worth continuing, perhaps. I think that one's a little controversial. B, example 2, called B here, example B, I suppose, not example 2, example B, I think is less controversial. And the idea is that severe chronic medical conditions, under certain conditions, in certain circumstances, I should say, can make a life not worth continuing. So Evan Bleege et al. Here in 2019 cite psychiatric disorders, dementia, and the accumulation of health problems, very general concept, I suppose there, very general phrasing, accumulation of health problems. These are the most common reasons for requesting and receiving euthanasia. So this Of course, this does not mean that all chronic medical conditions make a life not worth continuing, but just, I think you can imagine the worst ones that, just imagine the worst possible chronic medical condition, just severe, constant, ever-present pain, perhaps, would be something that would make a life not worth continuing. Okay, and then there's a further step here. The idea is that an immortal life, so a life that goes on forever, eventually would necessarily contain one of these, at least one of these two types of events, A or B, or both. And that it seems plausible, at least, that we should hope to die before one of these things happen. We should hope not to experience a disqualifying event of this kind. So just put it a little bit more formally. Seems plausible, at least, that certain events, call them P, render a life not worth continuing. Some subset of those events, call them Q, are events that occur as a matter of bad luck, whether it's the child drowning in the bath or some chronic health condition that's of no fault of your own might occur. Step 3, given enough time, some subset of Q, S, are unavoidable. Now, because an immortal life goes on forever, step 4 here, this means that an immortal life will eventually experience an event, or experience every event in subset S. Maybe that's a little strong. Maybe I could put that a little bit more tentatively. So we don't need to experience all of them to say that a life is not worth continuing, but at least one of them will happen eventually as a matter of luck. So then the conclusion states that an immortal life will eventually become not worth continuing. Okay, so just to summarize here, section 1. In sum, it seems plausible that an individual should not want to live forever for one or two or both, one or two or both reasons, that this life would eventually be boring, so boring as to make the life not worth continuing, and or an immortal life would necessarily contain an event that would make the life not worth continuing. Now, of course, these objections apply to an individual's life. So here, moving into part 2 now, it seems to me that group lives are different. And it isn't clear at all to me that either of these two objections apply to what I'm going to call and next characterize as an immortal group life. So what do I mean by group life? Well, kind of formal technical language, I would say that a group life refers to the time between the beginning and the end of a social group here. Now, a particular type of social group, namely one constituted by a plural subject in Margaret Gilbert's sense, where a plural subject is created by a joint commitment. Now, I'm not going to get into this defining these terms. I think most of you are familiar with or experts in these experts in these areas. But I'll just say I want to distinguish one thing here, because it is moving away from Gilbert's normal presentation of these ideas. I want to bring in Ritchie, 2016, Catherine Ritchie, where she distinguishes what she calls feature social groups. So groups like race, gender, sexual orientation, where the group is held together or constituted by, distinguished from a mere aggregate of people by some feature that the group holds, whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. So she distinguishes those kind of social groups from what she calls organized social groups, like unions, reading groups, philosophy departments. They're organized by some other principle, not a feature, but they're organized around a collective belief, a collective intention, collective goal or purpose, something like this. And so the group lives I have in mind are social groups in Ritchie's sense of an organized social group. Now, if that's all little unfamiliar to, that's totally fine. Informally, we can just say that a group life refers to a collection of people that are unified in a way that elevates the group beyond a mere aggregate of persons. So a statistician might pick out, an aggregate of people, call that a group. That's not what I'm interested in, but instead in this sense of an organized social group. And there's a distinction here that I want to make between terminal and non-terminal groups that I think I'll just leave as the slides, just in the interest of time. But what I have in mind here are non-terminal groups, so groups that are intended not to complete a project and end, but to go on for some time. Like I say here, the Shakespeare Appreciation Society. There's no prescribed end date to appreciating Shakespeare, right? That can go on for a very long time indeed. Okay, so let's shift. Let's go back to our two objections. Now, what I claim here is that an immortal group life would not have to be boring, would not be necessarily boring, in the sense that Williams and others have said that an individual life is necessarily boring. Okay, so why not? Well, it seems to me that a group has a potentially infinite attention span. Maybe that's a bit strong, but certainly a much more robust attention span than an individual, which means that the threat of content boredom is not guaranteed. It'll certainly still come up for some groups, but it's not guaranteed in the sense that it's guaranteed for the individual. So this means that, well, take an example, an individual monomaniacally devoted to a single goal, even if a praiseworthy goal, would be lacking in many ways, both from the first personal and third personal point of view, right? Imagine even just the most praiseworthy activity, like, I don't know, maybe this isn't the maximum, but improving labor relations at work. Imagine something like that. That seems good, but if that's all you did, you just ate when you absolutely had to, you slept when you absolutely had to, and the other 18, 19 hours a day you were trying to improve labor relations at work, seems like that life is missing a little bit of something. But that doesn't seem to track. That doesn't seem to follow for a group. A labor union, monomaniacally devoted to improving labor relations at work, that sounds good. Doesn't sound like there's the same problem there. And the secondary point is that, well, why? Well, because monomania about a single task makes sense for a group where it doesn't make sense for an individual, but also that new members keep the group interesting and interested. So even if some members lose interest, lose that fire in their belly for labor relations, maybe they'll move on to some other project and new group members will show up. Second point here is that a group life would not necessarily experience an event so bad that it makes the life not worth continuing. Now, it's not to say that groups can't do awful things. In fact, probably they can do much worse things than any individual could do. Seems right. But remember the two cases. So chronic illness, well, or debilitating physical pain, that's not going to come up for the group, right? A group doesn't experience physical pain or chronic illness. The other side does seem possible. What about being the source of a severe moral wrong, something similar to allowing the beloved child, not allowing, but being the source of neglect that results in the beloved child drowning in the bath? Well, certainly groups can be the source of that kind of moral wrong or accidental wrong. Think of the colonization of Indigenous people in Canada. Certainly that's much worse than the extremely regrettable death of a single child, right? We're talking about larger numbers of the same type of wrong. So, but instead of, starting a new country or being done with Canada, the country attempts reconciliation. Rather than end the group life, the idea is to learn from our mistakes, work on reconciliation, be aware of the past, and improve things in the future. So I need to leave it there, but just in conclusion, it seems at least plausible that an individual should not wish to live forever. Immortality would be boring, and it would necessarily lead to an event that would make the life not worth living. But group lives, to me anyway, seem different. It isn't clear that either of those two objections work in the case of a group life. And so in the end, we cannot, I say, and should not desire immortality for ourselves, but we can and often should desire that good group lives go on forever. Thank you.